The impact of Sharia law can be very sweeping, affecting our legal system, financial institutions, business decisions, schools, marriage and family relations, law and order, and our neighborhoods. Sharia law has become a topic we certainly need to pay attention to in our constitutional republic. The U.S. Constitution is the law of the land, and the challenges that strict adherence to Sharia law pose to our laws cannot be ignored. Our U.S. courts are increasingly facing cases where the defense invokes the adherence to Sharia law. We see this in cases involving adoptions, child custody, divorce, and more. This is one of the many reasons why members of Congress should start digging deeper into understanding Sharia law. The ballot issue in Oklahoma, which is now in the courts, is just the opening round in the growing struggle between Sharia law and the American political, legal, cultural, and religious environment. Today, our panelists will discuss how Sharia law poses a threat to our fundamental rights as protected by the U.S. Constitution, including the right to trial by jury, due process, freedom of speech, and religion. With the recent release of the Center for Security Policy's Team B2 report, a panel discussion like this is timely and appropriate, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists. Frank, thank you.
Thank you, sir. To sort of introduce the topic of what Sharia is, and to set, broadly speaking, the reasons for concern about its incompatibility, particularly with the Article 6 of the Constitution, I'm pleased to introduce the General Counsel for the Center for Security Policy, David Yerushalmi. He is a highly accomplished litigator who has developed a particular expertise in matters involving Sharia and our constitutional freedoms, a byproduct of a very distinguished career of some 25 years. I think his contribution to our Team B analysis on which he served is particularly important to the extent that it really has helped us assure that, as I'm sure will his remarks, what you know about Sharia based on this Team B analysis is what we have learned from the authorities of Islam. This is not our speculation or construct, it is rather what they say Sharia is. So, David Yerushalmi.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to set the stage. If you come to a presentation about the threat that Sharia might pose to the U.S. Constitution, to our way of life, two obvious questions have to come to mind. And if they're not answered up front, the rest of the conversation will be effectively meaningless. The first is, what is Sharia? Is it a thing? Is it objectively knowable? And the second question is, how could we worry, sitting here in the United States, in a constitutional republic, about some foreign law or religious code imposing itself on our way of life? Are we all going to vote for it? Now, I pose those two questions because those are precisely the critique that you heard when we introduced the Team B report on the threat to America posed by Sharia. It's precisely the critique you hear by the Council on Islamic Relations, a well-known Muslim Brotherhood Hamas front group that has essentially fronted this litigation in Oklahoma, challenging the Oklahoma Amendment, and many others. What are those critiques? First of all, there can't be a threat from Sharia. Why? Because it's unknowable. It's whatever any individual Muslim says it is, or I say it is, or anybody else says it is. It's not objectively knowable. The second, which flows from that, is it can't be a threat because no one's going to vote for it. So why are those stupid Oklahomans passing a law preventing Sharia from being imposed in its state courts when, one, it doesn't exist, it's not knowable, and two, we're not going to vote for Sharia. It can't impose itself on our way of life. Now, both of those critiques are false on their face. And they're false not because I'm going to tell you so. They're false because it's demonstrably false, meaning you can open your eyes and look outside and see that it's false. What do we mean by that? What is Sharia? Well, we all know generally what Sharia is. It's a legal, political, theological code and system that was developed over a millennia after Muhammad first made his presence felt in this world, establishing a law and political system for the caliphate, for the Muslim empire, which was probably the world's greatest empire through much of its history, meaning in terms of size and power. It was in history a real political, legal, theological system in which you followed it, you prospered. You didn't follow it, you suffered. Now, does that system, that legal, political, theological system exist today? Might it simply have evaporated as the Ottoman Empire crumbled after World War I? And the answer is no. Now, I said it was demonstrable that it exists. Go to Iran. The law of the land is Sharia. The Shia world, principally focused in Tehran and extending to Lebanon and many other locations, knows exactly what Sharia is according to the Shia world. Now, the Shia world is only about 20% of the Muslim population. So if you want to know what Sharia is in the Sunni world, which is 80% of the world's Muslim population of about 1.5 billion people, go to Saudi Arabia. It is the law of the land. If you want to know what Sharia is, go there and ask any of the judges, any of the imams, violate a given law, and you will learn very quickly what Sharia is. Now, where else does it exist? Sudan, Somalia, Gaza, large swaths of Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and indeed throughout Pakistan, as is true of most Muslim countries, Sharia's law relative to family matters, marriage, divorce, child custody, etc., inheritance, are governed by Sharia. Now, if you doubt your eyes and you say, they say it's Sharia, people's heads get lopped off as a result. We know that happens. Blasphemy is a capital offense. Blasphemy is a capital offense even in Pakistan. If you don't believe your eyes by looking abroad, then all you have to do is go to Al-Azhar University in Egypt, where President Obama went to reach out first to the Muslim world. Al-Azhar University is probably one of the oldest universities in the world. When Muslims take credit for the university system, they deserve it. They really do. It is the Harvard of the Sunni world. If you want to go to the citadel of legal understanding and jurisprudence in the Muslim world, go to Al-Azhar. And they have put their imprimatur on a book, which is a codification of Sharia across all the various Sunni legal schools. There are 4 major schools, but they've codified them. And they've determined that of all of those schools, here's the code, and it's a book, and all you have to do is open it. Now, having established that Sharia exists, and something that the panelists will discuss, and we'll also open it up to questions, how could this threaten our way of life? Well, I will tell you, it is already in the United States, and it's in the United States through 3 principal avenues. The first is comedy. If you get a judgment abroad in any foreign country, and you want to come to the United States and you want to enforce that judgment, collect on that money judgment, how do you do it? You take your judgment from a foreign court, you go into a U.S. court, and you say, I want you to grant this judgment comity, meaning I want you to give it enforcement power. The judge stamps his approval. You take it to a marshal, part of the police power of the state, and he'll literally enforce that foreign judgment. Now, what happens if that foreign judgment is Sharia? where there's no real due process. Equal protection is out the window because there certainly is not given the same legal rights to a woman as to a man, to a non-Muslim as to a Muslim. Yet the police power of the state will enforce that judgment. The second avenue is a choice of law agreement between two parties. If we agree between us in a contract that we want a certain set of laws to be the venue for the court to look at in terms of determining who is right and who is wrong, we can do so. What happens if the choice of law we choose is Sharia, in which, again, fundamental constitutional liberties are put at risk? Due process, equal protection. Was there a knowing waiver of those constitutional rights, or was it under force? And finally, the third avenue is a case of venue. Two parties, again, can agree that they will litigate all the matters between them in a foreign jurisdiction. We see cases all the time where courts are required to either adjudge disputes between parties based upon Sharia here in the United States, or they're forced abroad. Now, there's a twist on that last choice of venue issue, which is what's called forum nonconvenience. I'm going to give you a quick example. A young lady was visiting her parents in Saudi Arabia. She dove into a Sheraton swimming pool, which was owned by Sheraton Saudi Arabia. She broke her neck and became a tetraplegic. She came to Massachusetts for health care. She sued in Massachusetts court. When she sued, the Saudi Arabian corporation filed a motion and said, we want to litigate in Saudi Arabia because under forum nonconvenience doctrine, all of the witnesses are in Saudi Arabia, the damages were incurred there. We have the greatest interest to litigate in Saudi Arabia, and normally that is the correct argument. Normally the court would have transferred the case to Saudi Arabia, but what did this Massachusetts court do? It said, no, we're not going to do that. Because if we simply look in Saudi Arabia, we can see that this woman's testimony will not be credited as against the man's testimony. And number two, she's a non-Muslim. And the court literally articulated those arguments in its opinion and ruled that she was going to stay in Massachusetts. Now, I will simply conclude by telling you, for every court that reaches out to protect someone like that, there are a dozen courts that do just the opposite.
David, thank you. The supreme law of the land, Article 6, obviously being subverted in the ways that David's just mentioned. We're going to turn to the Seventh Amendment with our next speaker, Andy Cochran, of, as you heard me say, the Seventh Amendment Advocate, a web site that he has created, a follow-on to his earlier creation, the Counterterrorism blog. He has been consulting on these legal and other aspects of Sharia for some time, and it's a treat to have you with us, Andy, to talk about the implications of Sharia for the Seventh Amendment.
Thank you, Frank. Good afternoon. I'm glad you could all be here. And thank you, Congressman Lamborn, for phrasing the issue very well. I'm a lifetime Republican, former Reagan appointee, congressional counsel with Republicans. And for the last 5.5, 6 years, I've been working with, among others, American terrorism victims to try and seek justice through litigation and legislation. Represented Steve Emerson in the investigative project to bring some of his work to bear in Congress. Along the way, I started and ran the Counterterrorism blog for about 4.5 years. In June, I saw over the last 2 years really increased lack of awareness. It's a general lack of awareness amongst the population about the right to a jury trial for civil suits. And when you go back into the historical research, you see that the right to a jury trial for civil suits, which is enumerated in the Seventh Amendment to the Constitution, has its grounding centuries ago and is on par with the right to jury trial for criminal suits. The Seventh Amendment, just to read it, says, in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined, in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Now, this right goes back, its first real codification in British law is 795 years ago in the Magna Carta. Article 39 of the Magna Carta created the right to a jury trial for criminal and civil cases. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. British courts and British law upheld this right for centuries until excessive power by British monarchs started to deprive British citizens of the right. And in the 1500s, you saw this creation of the Star Chamber, which was designed to punish the dissenters to the throne. And for almost 2 centuries, the Star Chamber terrorized British citizens until Parliament demanded, when William and Mary were going to accede to the throne, that they end the Star Chamber in the late 1600s. The American colonists knew this. They knew this history. They knew how important the right to a jury trial for civil and criminal cases was. They knew how important it was to have an established body of civil and criminal procedure that provided some objectivity and transparency and predictability to civil and criminal cases. So even before the Declaration of Independence was drafted, American colonists were expressing their demands for the right to jury trials, as in the Virginia Declaration of Rights drafted by George Mason. In controversies respecting property and in suits between man and man, the ancient trial by jury is preferable to any other and ought to be held sacred. The Declaration of Independence included in its charges against King George that he, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, meaning criminal and civil. The Founding Fathers clearly recognized the right to trial by jury in all cases. Thomas Jefferson, I consider trial by jury as the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its Constitution. By a Declaration of Rights, I mean one which shall stipulate freedom of religion, freedom of the press, trial by juries in all cases. James Madison was specific in his defense of trial by jury in civil cases. In suits at common law, trial by jury in civil cases is as essential to secure the liberty of the people as any of the pre-existent rights of nature. We've seen that throughout history with Supreme Court justices expressing, again, the importance to protect the unalienable God-given right of the trial by jury in civil cases. And now we come to Sharia, and the reason I emailed some participants here and said, why don't we do this, was because the mosque controversy brought to light Imam Rauf's statements about Sharia. And when you dig into the historical research on Sharia, what do you see? You see that in strict Sharia, you see no juries, and in fact, little attention paid to objective, transparent, predictable procedure, criminal or civil procedure. In a Sharia court, the Qadi is the central figure. This is from something 40 years ago. In marked contrast to the more neutral role that a United States trial judge plays, the Qadi actively participates in the case. There are no juries. The judge's role is not to arbitrate, but to actively seek the truth and procure justice. And we see, again, this lack of juries and of transparent procedure in Sharia courts and in Sharia cases. More recently, some Sharia courts have tried to amend this, but we see, for instance, in the recent experience in Malaysia, where you have a bifurcated system of justice, Sharia for Muslims, regular civil criminal procedure for non-Muslims. That's not constitutional. Sharia courtrooms are antithetical to the constitutional protections that we and our ancestors fought for 795 years, and that people around the world have fought for years. Okay, and that's why civil jury trials are important for religious liberty, for protection against excessive bureaucratic power, and must be maintained. We should not allow these instances of Sharia courtrooms to invade and deteriorate our constitutional rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Finally, we'll have Daniel Huff from the Legal Project of the Middle East Forum, which he is the director of, to discuss the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the incompatibility of Sharia to it. Prior to coming to the Legal Project, Daniel served as the Senate Judiciary Committee's counsel to the then ranking member, Arlen Specter, in which he had responsibility for a host of civil, criminal, immigration, and national security matters. We're delighted to have you with us as well, Daniel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and particular thanks to Congressman Lamborn for helping host this event. We really appreciate it. We've talked thus far very much about people who experience Sharia or may be subject to it in a context of litigation, essentially, civil or criminal courts. And I want to talk a bit about people who are essentially going about their everyday business, not expecting it in essentially any context, when suddenly it's brought down upon them. And I mean that in the sense of the First Amendment, of speaking, discussing, talking about radical Islam or Islam-related issues, and all of a sudden you find yourself at the center of a controversy or a subject of a death threat. So the first slide, please, gentleman in the back. Well, we seem to be having some technical difficulties, but the point I'll make is this, that the central point that's going to underlie my remarks today is essentially that there is a prohibition on insulting Islam and insulting the Prophet in particular, and it's said to be a capital offense, and I put a source for it there. But the point is that there are a number of radicals who feel duty-bound to enforce this, not just within the confines of an Islamic state, but abroad as well. So that is their motive, to try and threaten people who discuss or criticize or in any way lampoon, draw cartoons of the Prophet of Islam and so forth. The interesting thing is, what is the method by which they do this? And essentially what they've done is they've done two things. On the one hand, they use physical threats. Those are fairly well known. The most recent example is Molly Norris, a cartoonist in Washington State. Her work inspired Everybody Draw Muhammad Day, a Facebook group. A number of people joined it. The idea was if everyone draws Muhammad on a single day, then the radicals won't be able to target any single individual. It waters down the pool of targets. Well, she went ahead and did this, and what wound up happening was that they targeted her anyway, and the FBI came knocking at her door and said, you need to go into hiding, and you need to go right away because you've been put on a terror hit list, and they're going to come after you. And she had to leave her job, and at her own cost. This is not witness protection where the government picks up the tab. She herself is paying for this, and she's in hiding, and her life's been turned upside down simply for trying to stand up on Facebook, which is something I think many people here do, just going to Facebook, joining groups, that sort of thing. So it's a very serious type of thing, these physical threats. But the other thing, and this is less well known, are legal threats, by which I mean Muslim organizations using courts and administrative agencies to try to suppress discussion of Islam. And you see this more in Europe because they have hate speech statutes there, so it's a little easier to do than you have in the United States. And a good example of it is the case of Daniel Scott, who was a pastor from Australia. I mention this case because Australia is a Commonwealth country, in the tradition of Western liberal values. And he essentially was part of a church that held seminars and discussed Islam and Christian understanding and went back and forth, and a complaint was lodged, and he went through a 5-year legal battle until essentially the Islamic organization that originally brought the case against him under a hate speech statute in Victoria, Australia, finally backed down, but only at great expense. And what was striking about that case is that this Scot was not a native Australian. He's from Pakistan, and he fled Pakistan because there's a very repressive blasphemy law referenced earlier, which essentially said that you can't, if you talk badly about the Prophet, you will be killed. And they sought to enforce it against him, so he fled. And he goes to Australia, he thinks he's safe in the West, and all of a sudden, he's punished for discussing Islam. And so he's right back where he started, in a Western country, and it's very jarring. But these types of legal threats are what we're going to look at a bit as well, in addition to the physical threats. Now, what I think is interesting to note is that most people, as I say, this is a problem in Europe. We don't have to worry about this here. We have the First Amendment. But there is a problem. The legal threats are on their way. And they're on their way through the UN, through the instrument of the international law. Now, how is this working? Well, there's an organization there's an organization called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC. It's 57 Islamic countries. You have to be Islamic to join it. And they are essentially trying to broadcast this prohibition on insulting Islam worldwide. And they're trying to do it through the instrument of international law. Now, very briefly on the OIC, if you look at their charter, it's clear that they operate under Islamic law, that guides their activities. And they unite this religious idea with extremely powerful economic power. Remember, OIC countries account for something like 70% of the world's oil reserves. So they're marrying economic power and religious power in a way that it's completely unparalleled. The EU is a economic powerhouse, but it is not a religious authority. Similarly, the Pope commands the authority over 1 billion or so Catholics, but he has no economic power really to enforce his statements. But you have here OIC, which is married, the political power with the economic power. So there's no render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And it's a very, it's a force to be reckoned with, the OIC. And they're sponsoring a resolution in the UN. They've been doing it since 1999 because that's how you operate. You sponsor resolutions every year. You get votes, and eventually it seeps into international law. And what the resolution would do is prohibit defamation of religions. The title's misleading. They say religions, but they really mean Islam. I know this because the original title was Islam, but they were urged to change it so that it should look better. They resisted this change, but ultimately acquiesced. Similarly, if you read the legislation, you'll see that the resolution refers specifically to Islam only. So they're trying to protect Islam, and it's not well defined. What do they mean? You can't defame Islam. But as an example of what they're talking about, there was a discussion of the problem of female genital mutilation in 2008. There was someone from a non-governmental organization speaking. And Pakistan and Egypt got very angry. They said we shouldn't have these types of discussions, and they shut it down, and they demanded that no further discussion of religion be held before the Human Rights Council, which would be ordinarily the place where this would be held. So the point is that this is a very dangerous situation, and it can come into the United States. How so? And this is, I think, the critical factor on the next slide. People think we're safe here. We have the First Amendment. If this thing were passed, it wouldn't make any difference, but it would. Why? Because the First Amendment rights are not absolute. First Amendment rights yield to a compelling government interest. If the government needs to do something, it's the only way to do it, they can impinge upon free speech rights and restrict the content of speech. And the danger here is that as the U.S. softens its opposition to these efforts, as you see up there, they co-sponsored a resolution with Egypt. They did various other things. They said, we want to work with you, OIC, on the defamation of religions. As that occurs, they're essentially saying that, well, it's important to us that this thing get passed or these types of things be permitted. And when that occurs, courts take a look at it and they say, well, the government's so concerned about this, perhaps the government has a compelling interest in following international law, even where it impinges on free speech rights. And you may say to me that, well, this is extravagant, this is not going to happen. It's already occurred. There was a case, Fincer against Berry in 1986. U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit that upheld a ban that D.C. had on displaying offensive messages within 500 feet of an embassy. And the statement was, well, we have to do this because the Geneva Convention, to which we are a party, requires us to defend consulates from impairments to or embassies from impairments to their dignity. So if someone's holding up an offensive sign, that could be an impairment to their dignity. We're duty-bound under international law to stop it. The D.C. Circuit looked at that and said, yes, you're right. There's a compelling interest in following international law. Therefore, we're allowed to ban core free speech, objections to holding up signs and so forth in front of an embassy. It was ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court on different grounds, but the point is the idea is there and it is coming, and people are not sufficiently attuned to it, I think, but hopefully this type of discussion will help make people more aware of the threat and ways of stopping it. Thank you very much.
Exiting stage right. Thank you, Congressman, very much for, again, joining us and making this program possible. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. I just wanted to sort of wrap this up, both by thanking our contributors and by just putting a fine point on it. We've heard of late, mention was made of Faisal Abdul Rauf, the imam pushing the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, a.k.a. the Islamic Center Park 51, that Sharia and the Constitution are actually really compatible. This reminds me of that old Groucho Marx line, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? The truth of the matter is, if you think the law of Saudi Arabia is actually indistinguishable from the Constitution of the United States, then maybe Faisal Abdul Rauf is right. Others have sort of picked up this refrain, some of them making the argument David addressed at the beginning that, well, there really isn't anything specific about Sharia. It's kind of whatever you want it to be. These points are, as David said, demonstrably untrue. And in fact, we are looking at a mortal threat to the supreme law of the land, the Constitution of the United States by its own terms, and the freedoms that we hold dear that are guaranteed by it. If we accept the insinuation and ultimately the adoption of Sharia in the United States. So this panel is, we hope, part of a debate that will become much more vigorous in this country in the days ahead. We hope that in particular the kinds of efforts to insinuate Sharia that have been touched on here, and we can develop at greater length with you if you'd like, are the subject for congressional scrutiny and investigation and hearings in the days ahead. Because one thing is pretty clear, if the kind of step that Daniel was just talking about that the Organization of the Islamic Conference has been promoting is allowed to progress unchecked, it's, I think, a matter of time before you find mutations of freedom of speech taking place here. I don't know if it takes the full form of hate speech legislation, in accordance with which, as he said, people are being tried in Europe and elsewhere, or whether it takes another form. But the point is, it won't be America if Sharia is part of our legal code, if it's allowed as a political reality to take hold in this country. In short, speaking for myself, and I think for my colleagues, we're about trying to keep America Sharia free. So we hope that this conversation is a good catalyst to that. And with that, we would welcome your questions. I think I'm going to have to ask each of you if you would to come up here and speak so that we can get it on mic and also have it amplified. Yes, ma'am.
This is for Mr. Huff. You talked about legal and physical. I'd just be interested in any comments on how you would characterize things that in effect are chilling because of fear. And the example I'm thinking of is when Yale University Press was pressured to pull the cartoons from the book, which meant that people who had a general interest in understanding the controversy were not able then to decide for themselves how bad those cartoons were.
Now, just so everybody's clear, this is a book that Yale University Press commissioned on the cartoon controversy and ultimately found it inexpedient to have the cartoons themselves in the book. Daniel, do you want to come on?
And it wasn't legal and it wasn't physical. It was
Mind-boggling.
Well, I do categorize that under the physical threats, and the way I look at physical threats is like an iceberg. You just see the tip, or it's 2/3 or 3/4 of it is under the water. And so we talk about physical threats like the threats against South Park, or the threats against Molly Norris, or the threats against the Facebook users. A lot of people are unaware. Recently, 11 Facebook users, random individuals, were contacted because their personal information was given over to a radical Islamic website because they had the temerity to join the Everybody Draw Muhammad Day group on Facebook. These are just individuals across America. They were contacted, and their lives are in danger. And even though they caught the perpetrator, the information's out there. And the U.S. Attorney says they'll be in danger for years to come. But the point is that all these types of things are just what we see. There's a lot of that below the surface. And the Yale University example is one of them. And as Donald Rumsfeld said a long time ago, we don't know what we don't know. And so there's things out there that people just don't write or don't say, or events that are never held because people are afraid, what if we do get attacked? And so I think you point to a very important matter.
Can I just say, when you heard Faisal Abdul-Rauf often portrayed as a moderate, peaceable, bridge-building individual, actually say that if we don't build the mosque, there will be violence, it's another example of how the so-called peaceable, tolerant Muslims, of whom there are many, let's be clear, authentically tolerant, moderate Muslims, but how those who are not so tolerant, moderate, just what we call in Sharia, the threat to America, the pre-violent Muslim Brotherhood, stealth jihadists, are perfectly prepared to use the threat of violence for their purposes as well. Yes, sir.
Yes. Could you comment on the fact that you have cities like Baltimore, Maryland, that I understand is the 10 square block area that the City Council or the Planning Commission has allowed Sharia law to prevail on, they say, minor domestic issues. You have in the city of Dearborn, Michigan, that much larger area been given, and now where I live in Anaheim, California, there's a proposal before the City Planning Commission to change one of our major boulevards in the shadow of Disneyland to Little Arabia. And what we have found out is that through the years, probably the last 10 years, they have purchased property up and down this major boulevard. Did anyone comment on how you see us dealing with something of that nature? At this point, it's just an enclave, not violence.
Well, over the last 5-6 years, I'm going to say that we have ignorance of two types: ignorance of Sharia and ignorance of American constitutional law, its roots, its history, its nature. I mean, I've got a pretty thick green book there, David, if you don't mind. That green book is the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Here's what 795 years of American constitutional and common law in the United States and Britain brings you. It's the Rules of Civil Procedure, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and cross-references, okay? I trust this book. I trust it. 795 years means something to me, all right? But I have to say, sadly, I guarantee you 90% of Americans don't know what the Seventh Amendment says, and 90% of Americans don't know that the right to a jury trial for a civil suit is in the Constitution. And 90% of Americans don't realize that great men, founding fathers, wouldn't sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights that included this right, the right to jury trials for civil and criminal cases. And so I just think this is really why I started the Seventh Amendment Advocate. I mean, if you're looking for a common thread between the Counterterrorism blog and the Seventh Amendment Advocate, it's ignorance of the threat. It's ignorance of the threat. I was concerned in both instances. That's why I started those websites.
So do you believe that the proposed legislation, as we've read here in the legal project, can address the lower level embryonic starts of these things like I see in Anaheim, California, or in...
It's great as it goes on speech, but unless Americans understand and stand up for their constitutional rights and understand the anti-constitutional nature of a Sharia courtroom, for instance, criminal or civil, we're not going to go far enough in protecting ourselves from those dangers.
David, did you want to say something?
I think the question is important to get at a very, or at least let's say, a more subtle point. As Frank said, there are a vast majority of American Muslims who are perfectly good citizens, have a First Amendment right to practice their religion any which way they want. The question is not Islam qua Islam, it's Sharia. The examples that you point out are ones that I can only imagine, because I don't know the specific ones, where two parties or even a community is provided the freedom under the Due Process Clause, free markets, property rights, to say, look, if we have a dispute, if my wife and I have a dispute, if my neighbor and I have a dispute, if we enter into a contract, we have the right to arbitrate our differences in our own courts, private arbitration. We have it in the Jewish world, you have it in the Catholic world, you have it in the non-religious world, with just arbitration panels. Happens all the time. When does it become a problem? It becomes a problem if the laws that they are adjudicating their disputes by violate fundamental constitutional liberties. That's the linchpin. If Jewish law does, it shouldn't be allowed. If Catholic canon does, it shouldn't be allowed. If Japanese law does, it shouldn't be allowed. And indeed, if you want to understand this issue in that broader context, how parties invoke the police power of the state through the court system, as we mentioned, through comity, choice of law, choice of venue, private arbitration being one of them, go to a website called publicpolicyalliance.org. And there is a specific legislative example, a uniform model act for any state to pass. Versions have already been passed in Louisiana and Tennessee, publicpolicyalliance.org. And it lays out very clearly, a state court cannot apply comity, a foreign judgment, cannot accept a choice of a foreign law or a venue if that foreign law, and Sharia would be included in that, but it's not, and it doesn't need to be specifically identified, would violate fundamental constitutional liberties. And this concept is not foreign to American jurisprudence. Void as against public policy has long since been a rule. But that's where it comes into play. Not simply because Muslims happen to be buying properties and want to live their lives within some kind of, self-sustaining community.
Let me just add one other point specifically on the question you've asked about what amount to no-go zones. If not initially, then certainly over time. As I think several of us have touched on, it seems incredible in this country with our Constitution, laws, and so on, that the sorts of infringements we're talking about could materialize. One of the reasons that we encourage people to look at the European example is not simply because in Europe they have hate speech laws and therefore they've had people prosecuted, well, for having the kind of conversation we're having with you today. It's also because in Europe you actually see what happens when these no-go zones are established and metastasize. It's a stunning statistic. I think actually it's probably dated now, but the last count I had was that there are some 750 no-go zones in metropolitan France. Just in France. And while we heard a lot recently about the initiative that President Sarkozy and the government of France took to ban the burqa, you can bet that in those 750 no-go zones, the burqa is being worn, and Sharia is the law of the land. Could that happen here? I think it could if we're not careful. Yes, sir.
The point of confusion I've had, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Yerashami, about you're saying that there's no problem with Islam qua Islam. Now, I've read a lot, and I've read a lot that seems to say if you're a good Muslim, you adhere to Sharia law and you demand that be applied. And there have been a couple of comments about, of course, there's plenty of moderate Muslims. So my question is, isn't a moderate Muslim a bad Muslim?
Let's take it out of the Muslim context. We're not going to take it out of my context. Let me give you an example. Could a good Jew walk around with a clean-shaven face and no little beanie on his head and eat pork every other Tuesday? Well, if you ask me, I would tell you no. I understand Judaism to follow a certain legal code. We have our own legal code called halakha, Jewish law. Now, what is the difference, though, between those two concepts? The difference, though, is that there is no theological code among any other religion in the world that imposes punishments, corporal and real punishments, and seeks control of political regimes, as Sharia does. Now, to answer your specific question, there are lots of Muslims in the world who simply say, I reject Sharia. According to Sharia, they are bad Muslims, no question. If they go to Saudi Arabia and they act like apostates, meaning they don't follow Sharia, they will be punished, if not subject to capital punishment. Same in Iran, same in Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the list goes on. But there are large groups of Muslims, and especially in America, where it is the most assimilated population, that simply said, just like my Jewish Reform friends say, I reject your silly Jewish law. It's for years bygone. It doesn't apply today. It just doesn't make any sense. Muslims say the same thing. It doesn't make any sense. Or Sharia is like matzo ball soup. It's a cultural thing. It's maybe showing up at the mosque during Ramadan. The question is this, though, for all of us, and especially for the Muslim community in this country and around the world. What is institutionalized Islam? That is to say, the universities, the madrasas, the social institutions, the public organizations that advocate on behalf of Muslims. Do any of those realms of institutionalized Islam reject Sharia? And that is a huge challenge, because I would suggest that very few, if any of them, do. That is to say, most of institutionalized Islam is exactly as you say. They follow Sharia. And if you go down the alphabet soup of Muslim organizations that suggest that they promote civil liberties for Muslims or some other cause for Muslims in this country, CARE, ISNA, NATE, etc., you will find, as the U.S. government has and has named them, as essentially Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas front groups that abide by Sharia. Now, do they speak differently in English? Of course they do. But when they tape them, when they surveil them, and they introduce that evidence into federal criminal trials, that's what you see. So the answer to your question, again, in summation is, to Muslims who truly reject Sharia, and I know several of them, and they exist all over the country, and they speak publicly, and they come out against Sharia. One that comes to mind, a friend of Frank's and mine, Zuhdi Jasser, a physician, former naval officer in Arizona, constantly comes out against Sharia. He's a patriotic American, and I would defend his right to practice Islam in any court, in any venue in this country or abroad. However, if he goes to Saudi Arabia, he is not going to survive any longer than I will.
And that's saying something. Yes, sir.
A comment and a question. We see in Europe one additional way that Sharia law becomes part of the law of the land, and that is misguided judges, either out of multiculturalism or fear of disturbances, voluntarily applying Sharia law. In Germany, you see that perpetrators of so-called honor killings get half or a third of the sentence on average that somebody else committing premeditated murder would. There was even a case of a non-Muslim German judge not long ago who cited Surah 434 in a criminal spousal abuse case, saying this accused only acted according to the rules that he was taught, therefore he should not be found guilty. My question for the panel, though, is this. It was pointed out here today, and as I also point out when I give presentations about Islam where I live, Islam is different from other religions in that it is not only a spiritual belief system, it incorporates this very pervasive legal code, which includes the precept of jihad, of aggressive warfare against other religions. Most people in this country have no idea of that. They see Islam as just another religion, like Buddhism is different from Christianity, different from Buddhism, but so is Zoroastrianism, so is Buddhism, it's just different, but we should accord it the same respect we want Buddhists to accord our own religion. So what's the big problem with that? And they don't see that there is this very aggressive ideology in there. And just educating rooms full of people of this size, 50 or 60 at a time, I don't think we will get there. We will run out of time before it's too late. How do we get the mass of people out of the country to realize that? What can we do so that people realize that Islam is different in that respect and we need to stand up?
Yeah. Let me start and then open it up to others. This question of what we're up against is really at the core of our new book, Sharia, the Threat to America. It is, I think, the absolute essence of this study, the distillation of it, that Sharia is about power, not about faith. If you actually can break the code that way, far from being entitled to the protections of our Constitution under the principle of freedom of religion, it is actually a seditious assault on our Constitution, which we are obliged to prosecute, not protect. How do you get that message to larger audiences than this? Well, I think if our camera is working, hopefully this will be available on YouTube and so on. But just as Faisal Abdel Rauf completely unintentionally aroused Americans for a time to a level of concern, certainly a level of awareness about what he was up to, by the affront of trying to put what, let's be clear, is a triumphalist mosque on some of America's most holy ground. I think what's happening, what that led to was this resolution in the ballot in Oklahoma, question 755, I think it was. Imperfect though it may have been, 70% of the American people who were asked to vote on that, almost 1 million people, said, we do not want Sharia to be the law of the land in Oklahoma. As David mentioned, there were 2 other states that adopted legislation that we think is actually better crafted. And I have the feeling that you're going to see in the next legislative session in states across this country still more, trying to ensure that at least their piece of America is kept Sharia free. And in the process, certainly in the process of the fight over the Oklahoma legislation, which CARE has now precipitated by seeking a restraining order to prevent the amendment from being adopted formally to the Constitution of the state of Oklahoma, you're going to see more Americans than ever starting to be aware of the stealth jihad that is trying to bring this totalitarian and, yes, seditious program to our country. With help of folks like yourselves, it'll be in time to stop it. Anybody else want to address that? Dan?
I just think that great changes in history have been brought about by small groups of people who started out, and the effort radiated. And if you think about the fall of communism and people standing up to that, beginning with the dock workers, I think it was in Gdansk, essentially things can travel out. And people take hold, and people start paying attention, and they kind of snowball and get bigger, and then great changes can occur. So I wouldn't worry about that as much as what I would worry about is the idea that there'd be an effort to nip the discussion in the bud at the outset, intimidating people, as I say, through legal threats or physical threats, and prevent people from discussing these things. Dr. Jasser, you mentioned before, I suspect he probably sometimes lives in fear of his life for the things that he discusses, and you want to make sure that people feel safe. So a condition precedent for all this happening is defending free speech, and that's one reason why we've proposed some legislation to give the same sort of penalties to people who threaten persons exercising speech on these issues that they would get if they were threatening people exercising abortion. There's a federal law that prevents threats against people exercising abortion rights, and it would seem to us that given the recent controversies and threats and so forth that have been perpetrated against people, there ought to be the same law to prevent the threats against people discussing these issues, and not just criminal penalties, but civil penalties, so the victims themselves can go and vindicate their rights in order to make sure that this conversation happens, to make sure that these triggers are pulled and that the discussion, as I said, snowballs until to the point where action is taken, as we saw in Oklahoma and the other states.
I'm on a big campaign. I'm going to spend probably half my time not just working in the halls of Congress on this, to try and educate Americans in as many ways as possible on the nature of our constitutional rights, history, and the threats to them. Yesterday I was on the phone to a conference of dozens of lawyers who had legal associations in all 50 states talking about the 7th Amendment. On Saturday, the president of the American Association for Justice, which is one of my consulting clients, formerly the American Trial Lawyers Association, will be on a showcase panel at the National Convention of the Federalist Society talking about the 7th Amendment and the history of the 7th Amendment. That's because when they put together the schedule, I talked to Federalist Society leadership. I've been a member for many years and a regular donor. And there's that showcase panel on Saturday which talks about reviving the right to a jury trial for civil suits. And I asked them to put Gibson Vance on, the president of AHA. My website and my Twitter feed are reaching out to Tea Party activists and constitutional conservatives across America. I'm a member of Tea Party Nation and Tea Party Patriots. And I've quite frankly, I was a constitutional conservative before I heard the term. I didn't realize it. So that's where I'm going. I'm trying to go the positive route of educating Americans on their 7th Amendment rights. But what we need to do is have, obviously, both sides of the issue here.
Thank you very much. Let me just say that I think you'll find among communities that have in fact been coming to the fore of late, notably the Tea Party folks, as defenders of the Constitution of the United States, are very alive to this problem and are a natural constituency to help the kind of work that we were just talking about. I have been told that we have to be out of here. Is that still the case, Ben, or can we go a little bit longer? A couple more minutes. Let me take one in the back of the room. Yes, sir.
David, I'm curious about one of the more novel arguments that's made in defense of the Islamic Saudi Academy, the madrasa in Northern Virginia. That is, it is Sharia compliant. It teaches kids who attend there. It is managed under Sharia principles. The citizens who have opposed that have been told that there is a protection of religious speech because that is a Sharia institution. That some of the stuff being taught there is protected religious expression, and so that when they teach to kill Jews or to kill Christians or assorted infidels, that is somehow protected by our First Amendment. And some Republican officials in Virginia say that, and I was just curious. I would like to hear David or any of you talk about that a little bit.
Well, unfortunately, the short answer is yes, it is protected speech. Why? Sharia isn't just a legal political system and doctrine, which it is. It runs entire countries, and it was designed to run an entire empire. However, it also has a theological component. A good part of Sharia law deals with what we would consider to be purely ritualistic or ceremonial, or even, relations between a man and his maker. So yes, it does have a religious component. But then you ask the question, well, one second. Does a religion have the right to speak freely and worship freely, as it were, if it also advocates the violation of U.S. law, the murder of X, Y, or Z? Well, the answer is, up until the 1980s, probably not, if that speech was likely at some point in time to lead to actual violence. So if an imam who has actual legal authority under Sharia, he's someone that people listen to. If he issues a fatwa, people will act on it because it's a legal normative directive, not just some theological statement of dogma. Then under pre-1980 First Amendment law, it could be prosecuted. However, the United States Supreme Court decided Brandenburg v. Ohio in the 1980s, in which a neo-Nazi KKKer got up and started calling for the death of Jews and the shipping of blacks back to Africa, etc. And the court said, that's pretty vile speech. It's not likely to lead to violence because no one was listening to this character. And moreover, even if they were listening, it's not likely to lead to imminent violence. That second prong, imminence, was added by the U.S. Supreme Court. So today, you can stand up and you can teach Sharia and you can advocate for the death and destruction of infidels, and as long as there's not likely to be an imminent reaction to that speech, then you cannot be prosecuted and you're protected under the First Amendment. Do I consider that atrocious First Amendment law? Of course I do. And the reason being is because if it ever had any validity under the so-called marketplace of ideas, I mean, that's the metaphor. The metaphor is that if someone is advocating violence or something terrible, as long as you allow it to percolate in the marketplace of ideas and other people can articulate their positions, eventually the good widget, the good speech is going to win out and there'll be no violence. But what happens if the Sharia faithful mujahideen, the warriors who would carry out those violent fatwas, aren't at that marketplace? They're not in the open marketplace of free ideas. They're listening to their imams in their very carefully constructed marketplaces. Well, those ideas are not going to win out. And so what is the difference if the blind sheikh, for example, who was convicted under a violation of seditious conspiracy, and all he did to get that violation was he issued fatwas. to people overseas to engage in jihad. The question is, if I issue a fatwa or some imam issues a fatwa that calls for the violence, the death of Salman Rushdie, for example, and there's no imminence, it could happen anytime. The man is still under 24-hour protection. Decades later, it's free speech. And that, of course, becomes asinine, to put a rather fine point on it.
Do we have time for another one? One more. Yes, sir. We don't have a mic, so go ahead.
Appreciate it. The panel's really terrific. My name is Anthony Milan from New York, and I've published a paper that gave a solution to the so-called controversy at Ground Zero in my capacity. I've heard it mentioned several times by the panel, and I'm very curious to hear what the panel thinks of the solution that I put forward and what solution perhaps our esteemed mayor and governor of New York might want to adopt. What I simply propose from my capacity as living in Saudi Arabia and a professional recognized in the field of counterterrorism was that there already exists an Islamic center at 1711 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. There are many mosques and cultural centers in Manhattan. 1711 is one of the best known, and it entertains both Sunni and Shia. So I propose that the place needs a paint job. It needs a little bit of refurbishment. So instead of $10 million in the Ground Zero place, which was stated to help heal the rift between New Yorkers and better understand the virtues of Islam, well, the outcome, as we know, that proposal failed. That perhaps the solution lay in refurbishing 1711 3rd Avenue, and therein lies the solution. Much as you find an example of one of the surahs of Muhammad where he solved the rift on how to refurbish the Kaaba and Mecca. So I propose that to the mayor and to the city, and it's been published out there and has yet to be addressed as maybe a simplistic but a common sense approach. What say the panel?
Anybody? I say that the problem is not the building. The problem is what goes on inside the building. And frankly, it's what goes on inside the building on 3rd Avenue.
You know this.
Not just the one that Faisal Rabb would like to put down by Ground Zero. The problem is Sharia. And, it's interesting. I mentioned, I think in my opening remarks, that there's been this, repainting, if I could use that metaphor, of the Ground Zero Mosque as not the Ground Zero Mosque. It's an Islamic center. As you mentioned, there are other Islamic centers, including in Long Island and elsewhere in the vicinity. One of the interesting things is if you study up on some of the more relatively contemporary practitioners and proponents of Sharia, particularly in the Muslim Brotherhood sphere, I think Sayyid Qutb as one of them. Islamic centers have been identified in the communications within the community as not only places where one would have a mosque and would have athletic facilities and would have kindergartens and would have, other sort of facilities for extracurricular community activities. There are also facilities in which one is to train the battalions. Now, you won't read that particular turn of phrase in Faisal Abdul Rauf's books, but it's notable because all of the other descriptions are there. So it seems as though it was selectively edited. And I must tell you, I personally do not subscribe to the idea that if he just moved it someplace else, or in your case, he simply took over what I think was originally his father's mosque up on 3rd Avenue. And I think he's on the board of that mosque.
The 17, just to add to the people who are not in New York, the 1711, the site, it's been there a long time, so among law enforcement, security, and counterterrorism people, it's already well infiltrated and well observed. So,
well, I hope so. I hope so. Based on we're going to have to probably wrap at this, but based on what we have seen to this point in terms of the kind of penetration that is described at length in Sharia, the Threat to America, the level of monitoring and surveillance is not what you would want it to be in a lot of these facilities. So it's all the more reason why we need this kind of discourse. We need this kind of greater awareness. We need this kind of, we hope, catalyst to congressional oversight and investigations. And again, we're very appreciative of Congressman Lamborn's presence here to help make that case, and we hope to help make that kind of investigation possible in the days to come. Ben, were you trying to get my attention? No? Okay. With that, thank you very much for joining us, and again to our wonderful panel.
Far away from